very nice to be back here, feeling amongst friends, which is very nice. So the topic for RIF then is adults' participation in adult education, adult learning, learning across working life, etc., etc. So I thought what would be helpful then is to consider different ways in which adults continue to learn across their lives, and also to draw upon some very recent data which has been gathered in Switzerland through the PIAC scheme, which was only made available the last month, in the 10th of December. So I'm going to try and set the scene and then engage with that data. So what I'd like to just to sort of set the scene, as it were, is some imaginings. Imagine if schooling was not compulsory. Oh, by the way, sorry, I should a couple of things before I say that. So, this PowerPoint, I think, is available for all of you. And at the end of it, I've got a series of appendix because there's too much content. So I've got this appendix at the end of it. If during my presentation there is any concepts that aren't clear, please raise your hand and I'll be very happy. Or if you've got any questions, I'll be very happy to take a question. Okay. Sorry, I should have mentioned that before. So some imaginings. Imagine if schooling here was not compulsory and children and parents had to be encouraged to attend and could elect how they attended and what courses they would engage in and for what purposes. How might schooling be different as a result of that? Consider the entire range of experiences through which children learn what they need to know to function in their social, educational and community worlds, such as the development of language, social skills. And what would a more inclusive concept of schooling look like or arise? And I guess in some sense both imaginings prompt the consideration of how we understand and develop further the discussion around adults' participation in lifelong education and lifelong learning, and how a broader range of educative experiences might need to be considered in that project. So what I'd like to propose is as follows: that adults' access to educative experiences, broadly cast, is critical to their personal and occupational development and contributions to their family, community and citizenship. And beyond being and remaining employable are the abilities to pursue social and cultural interests and make informed decisions for themselves and for others. And so I guess then securing and widening access to educational experiences then becomes quite central. And we propose here that institutional and societal imperatives shape education provisions and educative experiences and how access to them is viewed and enacted. And from adults' life history narratives, what's been revealed in a whole range of experiences, educative experiences that afford and engage individuals, and many of those come from within the communities in which they exist, the networks they engage, and not just through educational provisions, etc. So perhaps a more inclusive view about the purposes, practices, and provisions of adult education are suggested in conclusion. That is, having a broader concept, but also a broader set of experiences. So how I'd like to progress is just referring to 4 case studies initially. The first 2 are really about structured continuing education and training provisions that happen in circumstances like this. And then the third and fourth are about learning that sits outside, learning experiences that sit outside of educational provisions. And then to introduce this PIAC data, we can talk about that and what that's saying about Swiss workers' engagement in learning and through and for working life. And then some finishing comments then about what does this mean perhaps for adult learning in the Swiss context. But why do we want to engage adults in these educative experiences? Well, I guess there's a wide and growing acceptance of the importance of learning across the lifespan for personal, economic, social and cultural purposes. The personal ones are often about employability, well-being of individuals and their cultural betterment, that is, so that they can engage more fully in society and have a richer life. The economic ones are about workplace viability, national sustainability and sovereignty. And I'll just clarify what I mean by that, and that is because of geopolitical tensions at the moment, which seem to be progressing for for the foreseeable future, there's growing uncertainty about engaging in globalization in an open way, because this can lead to vulnerabilities. The most obvious one here was when Russia cut off the supply of gas to European countries. When in March 2020, out of a population of 26 million people, what we had in Australia was one factory producing the most basic face masks. You know those ones that are blue on one side and white on the other side? We had one factory, it had 4 machines, and one was broken. And guess where the fabric came from to make the face masks? We also had no production of PPE, personal protective equipment, for healthcare workers. And so there's a realization that not rejecting globalization, but the need to be able to provide the goods and services you require for your citizenship within the country, because if you're relying upon other countries, there's a risk to your sovereignty, national sovereignty. So there's a concern now, I think, in many countries about developing further the skilled workforce and maintaining that with countries that have aging populations. And then there's a social aspect of it, of maintaining societal cohesion and continuity, and at a time when we can all see there's a lot of political churning going on, with governments churning over and changes in the political landscape. And cultural, maintaining things that are important to us in terms of our cultural practices and beliefs, democracy, inclusion and fairness, and the idea that we want to live in countries where even our detractors prefer to live in those countries. So the idea that yes, we can be critical, but we have good societies to live in. So let me start with these 4 case studies. I want to start first of all with Singapore, and they have a provision of continuing education and training, and this is fairly central to the nation state. It's a national priority because Singapore can't grow its own food. It doesn't have the space to grow its own food. All of its food is imported. It has very little in the way of manufacturing, and it relies upon the skills of its workforce. That's its key asset. So in this report, the Economic Review Committee in 2010, viewing an aging population, because Singapore is the 3rd aged population on this planet, a key emphasis is on maintaining the quality of the human resources. And that Economic Committee said the first priority for Singapore is to maintain the skills of its workforce, its aging workforce. So they have, for instance, these special diplomas that adults engage in the 5 polytechnics and the Institute for Technical Education. And these are quite distinct from the diplomas that school leavers take. And there's a strong focus on occupational specific outcomes and employability, and they're usually held in the evening, face-to-face, 2 nights a week, and they're sponsored, and the attendance is supposed to be compulsory. And there's financial incentives. The Singapore government gives every Singapore citizen aged over 25 500 Singapore dollars a year, which is, I guess, what that would be about 480 Swedish flag, I think, something like that. And the citizens are given a credit account, and they can engage in lifelong learning programs. There's a selected list they can engage in, and they're given this money by the state, and they can get up to $4,000 to engage in employment-related further education if they're aged over 40. So strong government support and sponsorship for that lifelong education. And there was a study we had there that took place over, in fact it ended up being 3 years because COVID came along in the middle of it, where we did interviews with 180 graduates of CET programs, and then we did surveys of 860 Singaporeans. A big study, but I'll try and go through some of the quick findings of that. Most of the people who participated in these education programs did so for what they referred to as personal and professional purposes. Professional and personal purposes, but much of that was related to employability, work-related. There was, although it sounds strange, there was compulsory attendance, and this was actually quite valued by the participants because on the one hand, people are saying, well, because government gives us money that supports these courses, you should attend. But the most interesting one was groups of women who had young children. And I assumed that by having it made compulsory, this would be an inhibitor on women with children attending those courses. But quite the opposite was the case. What our informants told us is that this empowered them to say to their husbands, on Tuesday and Thursday night, you're looking after the kids. So this compulsory thing actually empowered them to make family arrangements. And there was a growing preference occurred for a combination of online and face-to-face provisions. What happened was, during COVID, they couldn't attend classes and people began using online provisions, as I'm sure occurred here. And it just so happened before COVID, we gathered data on these individuals' preferences for participating in CET. And then after what was in Singapore was called the circuit breaker finished, we then did a supplementary survey to see what was the difference, like before and after. And because people had got used to using electronic technology, they were far more comfortable with engaging online with CET programs. And they were able to provide detailed accounts of what they thought were good provisions that mixed online and CET. For instance, they would say that at the beginning of a course you should do face-to-face, then you could go online, and then you might have, towards the end of the course, face-to-face meetings again. So they came up with those ideas. And so it's also important then that these model modes of education can accommodate time-jealous adult students. So I don't know how this translates into French, but we often refer to people being time poor, not having enough time poverty. But time jealousy is that people have to be careful about their time and use their time in particular ways. And they will then only give priority to things that are important. So typically in Singapore, people have a long working week, and many of them are involved in church organisations at the weekend, and if they have young children, there's a regime of education which takes up large parts of their weekend. So these people have to make decisions about how they use their time quite strategically. And there's a strong reliance upon government sponsorship. Singaporeans have got very used to government supporting their activities, and when we asked people, would you participate in these programs if you didn't get the sponsorship, the answer was largely no. So that people have got used to getting sponsorship and support for participating. And so some of the findings we recommended was providing counselling to assist adults identify the kind of courses they should be doing, to make sure that they were ready for those courses and they were engaging courses that were helpful for them. And then once they'd completed them, trying to provide alignment with employment opportunities and exploring hybrid educational models, combination of the online and the face-to-face that would be effective for them, but also meet their requirements of busy adult lives. And that one of the findings clearly was that people have got dependent upon all of these incentives and subsidies. So if you withdraw them, then it's likely to be a problem. So another study was just one that's undertaken last year. And this was a study that looked at how we might widen access for mature age adult students. And it was based in the UK. And whereas the other study I just mentioned was really the perspectives of the students, this one gathered data from the perspectives of the educators and administrators. So this was about a survey of tertiary educators and administrators about how you could engage more adult students. And I'm using here the Australian data because we didn't get a lot of data from the United Kingdom. So we had almost 400 responses from people working in universities and vocational education institutions. And we asked them what constitutes a mature age student, how they might be encouraged and engaged with and supported to achieve success. And some of the relevant findings, I've included some tables at the back of the presentation, but some of them was that mature age students were seen as those who were aged over 21 who had not gained direct entry into universities after schooling. And the concept of failing to gain access was prevalent, so it was commonly mentioned in reference to that. So this indicates the profiles and characteristics of these students are distinct from school leavers, because often school leavers have been prepared to move into university education, and perhaps some of the others hadn't. And 50% of the institutions reported actively recruiting and identifying those students on entry. And there were different purposes for providing support for those students, or the degree by which they were about achieving institutional goals. Because looking at the reasons why they're interested in recruiting these students, it was possible to see some was about supporting them and others was about achieving institutional goals. So what was interesting was across the universities, the data was more strongly about supporting the students. And then in vocational education, it was about achieving institutional goals, such as the numbers of students they could get. What's interesting in terms of the policy framing is that higher education institutions in Australia are graded by government in terms of the number of students that complete. And we have performance measures, and so universities have arrangements in place to ensure that students do succeed and progress through. I think that's reflected in that data. So a government imperative is saying that we want to reduce the number of dropouts in the first year, and so many universities have first year programs. They have green, orange, and amber, green, amber, and red lights for students who are not doing well, and they intervene, etc. But that is, in some sense, responding to government edicts. And overall, then, the activities were to engage mature age students, and this often ranked higher in some institutions than their efforts to support their learning for the students' needs. And those that had ongoing resource implications tended to be ranked lower than those making one-off arrangements, and that's in the appendix. But one of the fascinating things here was the perspectives of the educators. And I was quite surprised by this. The educators talked about their experience with these students, and you'll see here that most respondents reported experience with the mature age students as being negative. And there's a statistical, and you'll see there, by the way, that almost 78% said that their engagement with the mature age students wasn't positive, which I thought was very strange for tertiary education. And there were statistical differences between those who were younger, under and over 40. And that was the younger the teachers, the more they reported difficulties of dealing with these terrible adults. Okay? And the reason they said those adults are terrible, about half of them reported challenges to accommodate and manage mature age students' needs, that they required individual and additional support. And this is what they said, that it was very difficult balancing student study needs with competing commitments. They have work, family, and personal commitments. And the classroom facilitation to include mature age students was seen as being a problem, and accommodating mature age students' work-life experience and perspectives in educational activities, and providing relevant and up-to-date resource materials, and facilitating classroom discussions with younger students. Now, funnily enough, there was a very similar expression from the Singapore study, because we did some workshops at the end with the teachers and administrators to gauge their responses to what the people who graduated had said. And what I was aware of is that many of the people in the polytechnics in Singapore didn't have much work-life experience, and they were very, very nervous about engaging with adults who had extensive work-life experience. So although these two studies are in quite different countries, from different countries, still that concern, particularly by people who perhaps haven't had a lot of work experience, of dealing with students who had had different experiences and other experiences that they had had. So I thought that was interesting. Now I want to go on then, so those two studies are about continuing education and training in programs, a bit like this, where people sit and somebody talks at them. Perhaps it's online, perhaps it's like this. But the project that Laurent and Henning Salling-Olsen and myself had in Australia was to look at the processes of learning across working life, including the transitions that adults had across working life. And we did detailed work-life histories of 66 working Australians, 2 rounds of interviews. The first one was we met them and said, tell me your life story, your work-life story. We turned on the digital recorder, and most of them talked for an hour or more. And then we had a second interview, a follow-up interview, where we asked them about things they'd told us, and I got them to respond to some different kinds of measures. And then we did a survey of almost 700 working age adults, which included refugee migrants and indigenous Australians quite deliberately. And 2 concepts arose from this study. I mean, this is obviously a huge study, but that came out as being particularly important in understanding adults learning across working life. The first one is the concept of the personal curriculum, and the second one, the range of educative experiences that these adults reported to us. And together, I think these help understand what constitutes learning across working life. But just to make a point, because this keeps on getting, this issue keeps on coming up, I want to point out the differences between lifelong learning and lifelong education. And one of the difficulties with discussing these issues is that if they get into the official lexicon, such as the OECD, it's very difficult to get them out. So people talk about, for instance, informal learning. It's actually in the OECD website, and they define it, which to me is a nonsense term, because how do you learn informally? Does it suggest that your cognitive, neural, and sensory systems all of a sudden go into a mode called informal? And then when you're in a situation like this, your cognitive, neural, and sensory systems are engaged in a formal process. I think there's informal education and formal education, but the language has been conflated, and much of what is talked about in terms of informal learning refers to actually experiences that sit outside of educational settings. But the same thing occurs about lifelong learning and lifelong education, because you often read in documents that these 2 concepts are conflated, and they're totally different. Totally different. I mean, so lifelong learning is a personal process of change in what individuals know, can do, and value, and this occurs across our entire lives. It starts, some would say, before we enter the world, and it finishes when we lose cognition or we simply die. And that's a process. It's a personal fact, the fact that we learn, and people will learn in different ways from the same experience. And lifelong education is the provision of experiences. It's the organised set of experiences often to achieve specific educational goals. And I think it's important we realise that on the one hand, lifelong learning is what is referred to as a personal fact. How we make sense of things is based upon how we construe and construct knowledge from what we experience on the one hand, whereas on the other hand, lifelong education are sets of experiences and often designed to achieve specific goals. And it's important to remember lifelong education, for instance, CBT programs like this event here, is just but one process through which working age adults learn. And it's important to be open to the range of experiences that adults have that are educative, that help them learn. And so we need to go beyond thinking about supporting lifelong learning simply through educational programs. And the important thing I think here is that by just privileging lifelong education, it ignores most of the learning that occurs across adults' life. And if you look at the kind of engagement that people have with educational experiences, such as educational institutions such as this, it diminishes across, for most of us, across our lives rather than increases. So we need to be more inclusive about those experiences. So it includes work-life learning of interest to individuals, their employers, and governments, etc. And so I think it's important we acknowledge the key sources of learning through and across work life and how the community supports that. So one way of thinking about this, just to elaborate it, is the problem solving that occurs through our work activities. So I'm going to introduce here some of the data from the Programme of International Assessment of Adult Competence, PIAC. Who here is familiar with PIAC? So PIAC is this kind of like the adult version of PISA, but it's not. It's different, but it's like a program, an international program and it's by the OECD, and at one level it's tried to do the same thing as PISA does, and that is compare different countries' education systems. And I recommend you don't go down that pathway when you're using this data. But it's this international system. It's had 2 rounds and 2 cycles, I beg your pardon, and the data for the second cycle was released on the 10th of December last year, so it was about 10 weeks ago. And for the first time, Switzerland was included in the data. So this is data here from Swiss people. Now, two of the items they ask the informants, and by the way, when PIAC is done, it's not an online survey, it is actually done, a person, it actually interviews each of these people, and you'll see over 6,000 Swiss working age adults, because the data goes from 16 years to 65 years, 6,000 folk. And 2 of the questions they ask is, how frequently in your work do you have to solve a problem you engage in a problem that you can come up with a solution between 0 and 5 minutes, and then a problem then that you have to take between 5 and 30 minutes to develop the solution. Now, we refer to the first kind as routine problem solving, and that's the kind of problem solving which reinforces, refines and hones what we know, can do and value. And the second kind, non-routine problem solving, is we extend our knowledge because we're pressed into thinking new solutions, developing new ideas, so it extends what we know, can do and value. And that is also associated with innovation, because you're doing something new in responding to a problem in the workplace. And you'll see here in this data that Swiss workers report that at least once a week, 23% engage in simple problem solving, and every day 59%. And that these demanding problems that you'll see there, every day 14%, and at least once a week 35%. So what this data is saying is that workers in Switzerland engage, 82% report engaging in routine problem solving, which reinforces, refines and hones what they know. and 49% talk about at least weekly engaging in activities that transforms or generates their new knowledge. So this is very strong data which talks about the learning that arises through our everyday work activity. And it's interesting, I haven't done this yet because the data is quite fresh, but in the first cycle, the highest level of engagement in non-routine problem solving was not the professions. Guess which occupations it was in? Anybody like to take a guess? Technicians. Which when you think about it makes sense, doesn't it? Because they go around and fixing our computers and fixing our cars. And of course what's interesting is that a lot of technical workers come from the vocational education system. So not necessarily the higher education system. Interesting. And the important thing is that non-routine problem solving is both requiring higher order thinking, but it's also generative of higher order thinking, that you're pressed into thinking in ways that extend your knowledge. There's also, the PIAC data also indicates how Swiss work. These Swiss adults engage in three kinds of learning. Learning new things, learning by doing, and keeping update at and through their work. And again, we have figures here about at least once a week and every day. And this is what these workers are saying in terms of that learning new things, that they're saying that 30, you can see the figures there, I don't need to do the maths for you. So learning new things, learning by doing, and then keeping up to date. So this indicates that these workers are reporting that frequently through their work they're engaging in learning, and this is often learning something new is then generating new understandings, new procedures, and perhaps new dispositions. So this then indicates again that higher order and strategic knowledge is occurring, and that learning through work isn't just what's often referred to as concrete. No, it doesn't apply anywhere else. Rather, it's the kind of knowledge that is potentially adaptable. And that this then, but this kind of learning is very rarely acknowledged or formally captured or certified or viewed as being educative experiences. In most of the apprenticeship programs, and I can't speak for what happens in Switzerland, the only kind of knowledge which they tend to be viewed as being important is that the component which is done within education institutions. In different countries, they have arrangements whereby the learning that apprentices to do in their workplace is often dealt with tick boxes. They have to tick boxes, they learn certain things, but it's not privileged the way that the learning occurs within education institutions. Now this concept of the, I've got this dreadful definition here, but whenever you write a definition you're trying to capture the complexity of it, and this is an example, but the personal curriculum really captures the original meaning of the word curriculum, because the meaning behind the word curriculum was the course to progress along, the pathway to follow. Now what's interesting in curriculum theorizing is that people like Dewey, the American education philosopher, and also Billett in America, who was one of the first curriculum theorists, referred to the totality of experiences that people have, not just those within education institutions. And one of the first books that captured the curriculum project was that by Ralph Tyler, which was written in 1949. And he was a sort of, he was a person interested in evaluating experiences. And he came up with a definition that the purpose of the curriculum was to meet the goals of the school. It was all about achieving the outcomes of the school. But before that, people like Dewey and Billett had been seeing curriculum as being a far broader set of experiences. So here, from this data that we gathered, it is possible to say that we need to understand adults learning through their personal pathways, their personal curriculum, because they spend some time in education institutions, perhaps early in their adulthood, late adolescence, but then they have a whole range of experiences. So even the concept of, which I looked at the workplace curriculum isn't sufficient because there's learning that occurs outside of that within family and other activities. So viewing curriculum not as an institutional fact, that comes from participating institutions like education institutions, workplaces, but rather seeing it as a pathway that individuals take is perhaps not only more consistent with the original meaning of the word curriculum, but it captures the totality of experiences that these adults have, the ones that we interviewed and discussed their life histories. So it's shaped by the educative experiences they have in schools, workplaces, and particularly within communities. And it shapes individuals' direction and it elects how they engage with them and learn through them. And so it would seem that individuals' personal curriculums are shaped by three interrelated mediational means. So that means what shapes their learning. And the first one is the individual, their capacities, interests, intentions, and how they make sense of things, which also includes maturation, how things change as we change over time as we get older, for instance. And then there was the educative experiences, the access to and the kinds and quality of experiences we have, which, afforded by hybrid experiences in education institutions, but also in practice. And then what came out quite strongly was the contributions of community afforded by familiars, acquaintances, and social networks. And so one of the conclusions from this, by the way, is a paper I'm trying to write but never seem to be able to do it, is that we refer to a child being raised by a village. The title of this paper is "It Takes Villages to Raise an Adult," because adults get engaged in a whole range of communities. And in terms of these educative experiences, and this is using, because Dewey actually, I think, coined that term, and he referred to educative, the education process has no end beyond itself, it's its own end. It is itself a process of living. So he had a very holistic view about learning through experiences. So taking Dewey's idea about educative experiences, that we define these in terms of those that guide, assist and support individuals' participation in activities, and particularly we looked at the transitions that adults had. And across this 66 adults, most of them had 10 or 12 transitions across working life, and were able to map the kind of contributions to their, I think we had over 600 and something transitions that we were able to map, and looked at how they'd been supported in those transitions. So what we found there was 5 of them. There was experiences that provide guidance towards and opportunities for individuals to engage, and these were also support for engagement and support to mediate access knowledge, and to guide the development of those capacities, and to acknowledge, capture and certify them. But in this statement, you'll see there's a qualifying clause for each of these, and that is that which they would not have otherwise had they not been able to access them. So I'll tell you a quick illustrative story. One of our informants, in February 2020, he was the king of the skies. He was the captain of a Boeing 777, flying out of China, flying intercontinentally, and in Australia we refer to masculine men as blokey blokes. So he was a man who was very masculine and very proud of his job. 2 weeks later, he was unemployed. Because COVID hit, all the airlines stopped flying, and he was repatriated to Australia. And he's 55, and he was very worried that he would never fly again. Because when you get to 60, you have to be put on with a younger person, and then when you're 65, you can't fly intercontinentally. And so he began then to work out what he would do. He wasn't happy person, for obvious reasons. And he'd done a graduate certificate in aviation law, and he thought he might try to look at law as a career. So he enrolled in a bachelor's of law and hated it. They particularly hated academics, I should say. But he was this airline pilot, and he was a member of a golf club. Do you have golf? And the membership of the golf club included justices, solicitors, barristers, etc. So he was engaging with these people about his potential law career, and they were giving him advice, and one of them found him work one day a week in his practice. So, and this thing provided him with the kind of set of experiences which, if he hadn't been a member of the golf club, he wouldn't have access to those people. So those people provide him with advice, support, guidance, and opportunities to learn. So that's an example of this range of experiences. It didn't end happily, unfortunately, but because he decided from this work experience that being a solicitor wasn't for him. But that's another story. That's just to illustrate them. But there was another story I've mentioned, and that is there was a woman who she was a woman who started out with very low-level jobs in Britain, like working in a retail setting, and her supervisor realised that she had greater potential. So she did a degree in the Open University in Britain, which accommodates older people, and she did a social work degree. And then she ended up working in social work in Brittany. Her husband was transferred out to Australia, so she came along with him, and she got a job as a social worker in the youth justice system in Brisbane. She became interested in being an educator because she wanted to try and avoid young people getting into problems and getting into the justice system. So she became an educator, and then one day she was at this a professional development event, and she thought this was very good. That afternoon, she was walking her dog. We have these places in Brisbane where you let your dog off the leash, the dogs run around. Do you have that here? And she got talking to another woman, and this woman said, well, this was this great experience I had today, professional development experience. And the woman, she said, I'd like to do that work. And the other woman then said to her, guess what? I work in that unit, and we have a vacancy coming up. And so she got the job. But the Indigenous member of our team, Debbie, said that had the woman been an Indigenous woman, the other woman probably would not have talked to us. So that opportunity would not perhaps have been available to her. So that is these experiences. They're captured by culture and situation. So I'm telling stories which takes lots of time. But one thing we did find was, which was quite surprising, was across all of these instances of people's learning, the importance of community. And here there were some figures in terms of some of the 162 of these instances of what the kind of ways in which, inverted commas, community played out. So that these experiences, the support they received, was of that kind and from those sources. And so from the sources and contributions of these educative experiences, it was possible to look across these institutions, workplaces, community and education, and to find that most of the support that came from, most of the educative experience of three kinds came from workplaces. There were some that came from community, and education was most frequently acknowledged for capturing and certifying the knowledge that had been learned. So again, it suggests a broader base of educative experiences and their sources. And so I guess what this suggests then is that we need to think beyond orthodox lifelong education provisions to think about it more broadly. Now the final case study is a project which was undertaken in Singapore, two projects in Singapore, and the idea here was to examine the co-occurrence between workers' learning and innovations in the workplace. And the idea is that when, so there's two of these studies that were done in small to medium-sized enterprises in Singapore. And the idea here is that when you innovate, you actually learn, because you have to do something new. And when an innovation comes from outside of the workplace, all too often you have to work out how it fits within your workplace. So you have to accommodate it and suggest it. So one of the enterprises was a food manufacturing company that produced steam buns, the steam buns that Chinese folk love. And this was a family company, and they had a particular steam bun, and the steam bun had a nice sheen on the outside of it. They bought a new machine from China, but it wasn't just a question of turning the machine on and putting the ingredients in. They had to work with it for a long time to actually get the kind of product they needed from it. So the idea here is that when you engage in innovations in the workplace, you're learning, and this perhaps is a good model of how workers can continue to learn across working life, but also how enterprises can then be sustained through engaging workers. And through the second of these two studies, it was possible to identify three types of innovations. Strategic innovations, which was about changing the purpose of the business. Work practice ones were about how the actual ways in which the work was done would be changed. And then procedural innovations, how you refined and honed processes that improved practice. And it was that latter one that was the one that was most frequently identified as how workers engaging, identifying and enacting them. And each of these three types of innovations offers a distinct zone of development for workers, the potential for them to engage in activities which would extend their knowledge if they were allowed to do so. And this then is, as I said, procedural innovations were the ones that were most frequently initiated and engaged with by line workers, which is related to the concept of employee-driven innovations, which comes from Denmark. So the greater the involvement in initiating, identifying, justifying, and enacting innovations, the greater the learning potential. Because often what happened in workplaces, when somebody came up with a new idea, they actually had to justify it to other people to adopt it as practice. And that process of justifying the argued case was also a process to which they had to learn and justify it. And I think this is quite well related to Vygotsky's concept of the zone of potential development. And elsewhere, I think we know that the popularized concept of the zone of proximal development, which I'm sure you've probably heard of, didn't come from Vygotsky. That came from Bruder. And that what Vygotsky talked about was, in fact, the agency and the exercise of the learner, which he referred to as the zone of potential development, the scope in which an individual could learn by their own excitation and interest. And the zone of proximal development came from Bruner in his idea of scaffolding, etc. And I could talk about the justification for that, but that's another talk. So it's related very much to individuals' agency and the exercise of that from Vygotsky's concept of the zone of potential development. So this then leads us to this PIAC data. And as I mentioned to you, the PIAC survey was about this about work-related competences, and the second cycle was released on the 10th of December. 31 countries were involved, and some of the countries involved in Switzerland, you'll see over 6,600 participants, Singapore 5,000, and the UK 5,000. And the data here is about work discretion, learning, innovation, problem-solving skills, and you can use things like age groupings to look at different cohorts, and I've been using it to compare societal sentiments, that is the way that workers are engaged in their workplaces. And the reason that I use this data, because I'm a qualitative researcher, is for a couple of reasons. Firstly, that the data that I've used from this has face validity. It seems to be reliable in terms of, and valid in terms of the kind of data I gather. And I think it's because there's individual interviews sit behind this data. It's a substantial body of data, as you can see from that number of people, based on face-to-face interviews. And the other, perhaps, meta reason is that an awful lot of theorizing about adult learning and development is not based on data. It's based upon speculative accounts. And if you think of many of the key adult theorists, whether we're talking about Knowles, Mesereau, Alan Tuff, David Bowd, they don't gather data. They sit on their bums and write books. And so we're actually short of a lot of data. So this provides a good source of data. Controversial, it's open to all sorts of criticisms, but I think it's helpful. And so I think it has rich descriptive potential. You can do all sorts of variables with it. However, I caution against doing simple comparisons. One country is better than the other countries, because that's not helpful. It's not a good way of using the data. So you need to account for situational factors. So let's have a look at some of this data then. From Switzerland, as I said, 6,648. And that's the sample there. So see there's a spread across ages and there's a spread across genders. And I've done some comparisons here with the United Kingdom and Singapore. I wanted to do Singapore and Sweden for particular reasons. Singapore because it's an elderly population, and Sweden because Sweden has these high social democratic values which are supposed to be enacted in the workplace. But unfortunately the Swedish data didn't cover some of the things that I wanted to talk, so I've used the UK data instead. And so you get variables like this of how frequently did Swiss people engage in training, and the number of training activities. And you see some curious figures here from the Swiss people saying that 41% said they just had one experience, whereas the UK people said they had more than 5 experiences. So you see different patterns. I can't explain that. I have no basis for explaining that, but you see different patterns. And so what I suggest then is the majority of Swiss adults engage annually in 1 or 2 training activities per year, because if you add those numbers together, it's 60 something or the other. The focus of what they said, this is the Swiss folk, is that they were actually related to work-related activities, and you see those figures there. And these are the kind of focuses of the training activities that these workers reported engaging in. And what I've done is, when you get this data, you try and do something with it. And here, what I've categorized are those into occupation general, so competencies which apply across a number of occupations, OS, which is occupational specific, and then RE is recreation stuff. And I could be, this is just my assumptions. And so you'll see a pattern there, and what you'll see is that perhaps the majority of the focuses of this training is actually occupational general. It applies across a number of occupations, and a lesser number then being occupational specific, and then a lower number being for recreational purposes. In terms of reasons for participating, here you'll see that in Switzerland, for instance, the highest frequency, which is bolded on this table, is about improving my knowledge or skills on a subject of interest in me, so it's interest. So again, I've categorized these. The yellow ones are personal motivations and interest, and the blue ones, PRF, is professional interest. And there is then bracketed it's about advancement, it's about interest, it's about work performance, certification. I was obliged to participate, so it's been mandated. And I guess increasingly, some occupations have mandated professional development activities. So you can see this kind of data, and perhaps this audience here can interpret this data far better than I can, because you would understand what sits behind some of this. So what we see here is a pattern across these countries, so there's different events occurring. You see Singapore, for instance, is far higher, focus on improving job directly, about opportunities. And then here we have the organisational experiences, and what you'll see is that face-to-face is the dominant mode in Switzerland. whereas in the UK it's suggesting that online is more focused. And then the combination of the two is less supported in all three countries. And then when this occurs, and so only in paid working hours, blah, blah, blah. So this data then is prescriptive data, and that is that. So, and then almost finally, I think, they were saying barriers they reported barriers, outcomes and barriers. So outcomes, whether it was not useful at all through to very useful, and you see the different grades across the countries. I should add that if you add up moderately useful, very useful, you'll see that Switzerland comes out on top, not by much, if that's important. And you see that pattern then, that people are saying that overall they found what they got as useful. So they referred to usefulness, and that was very useful, the data is there. And in terms of barriers, this is what these individuals reported, and you'll see here that the most frequent barrier was I had no time due to work-related reasons, and that was consistent across these three countries. So that brings us back to this issue of time jealousy, that we need to have CET provisions which fit within busy working adults' lives. And the two most frequent barriers were a lack of time to engage, followed by costs, and I've categorised these in terms of resource constraints and this was other data coming in here about resource restraints and lack of prerequisites, which people indicated. So what does all this say? I think in sum it says that most Swiss working age adults from this sample engage annually in 1 or 2 training activities per year, and main focus can be categorised as occupational and general, developing further their work-life capacities. And they do so mainly for professional, personal purposes, but mostly related to their job. The training provisions were predominantly face-to-face, and only about half of this occurred in work time, which was lower than other countries, but widely reported as being useful for their work. And the key work barriers are work and family commitments, difficulty in finding appropriate courses, cost, and accessibility. And accessibility, broader engagement with online education seems to be a way forward here to try and meet the needs of time-jealous working age adults. So to conclude then, I think we need to think about approaches to increase adults' participation in CET. Needs to include having tertiary education system institutions with clear intents and processes to support them, which includes processes. I think a lot of CET programs essentially evolve out of with programs that are designed for young school needs, and then they're adapted for CET, rather than starting afresh and saying, well, how can we address the needs of working age adults? And I understand why institutions do that, because it's issues of scale and cost, etc. Also, and we need curriculum models and pedagogic practice suited to these time-jealous students, and educators who are adequately prepared to facilitate the learning of diverse kinds of adult students. So you might have been really surprised by that reaction of those educators who were saying that they didn't like working with mature age students. Now, I guess most people in this room are used to working with adults, and so it's like what we do. But if that's not your field, the idea of working with people who know more than you is seen as being highly threatening. But I guess the strategies that we use is we accept that our students don't know more than we do, and we work with them. But if you're trying to see yourself as the authority, that can be quite problematic in terms of the sense of self and professional practice. And we need, I think, counselling to advise and guide adult selection of courses, and a community orientation to encourage, guide and support adults. And then acknowledge, capture and extending and certifying the learning arising from work activities and interactions, and then workers initiating, enacting work innovations as a powerful approach for ongoing learning, because what we know is that workplaces are constantly innovating. They have to maintain their viability, and that provides an environment in which both workplace innovations and workers' learning can flourish. I would propose from the data. So I might finish there. I think I've probably taken more time than I should.
It's okay. Thank you very much.
Questions?